I'd venture that all of us carry regrets, that is, sad memories of past mistakes that we've made. Can reflecting on such mistakes be helpful to us, or instead does it sometimes hold us back? Many of us believe that focusing on such regrets can be helpful in our process of ethical learning. But interestingly, the Buddha taught something slightly different, which we'll get to in today's video. First, what is regret in early Buddhism? Well, it's a concept that's covered by various terms in Pali. Vipatisara, anuttappa, even kukucha or remorse. The dictionary definition of regret, which we'll have to keep in mind, is that it's a sadness, a repentance, or disappointment over something that has been done. And in the context we'll be discussing today, really, it's over something that one understands as having been done by oneself. Now, ordinarily, I think regret is understood to be a wholesome recognition of our past wrongdoing, and this is how I conceived of it. However, in the early texts, the Buddha has a somewhat different interpretation. For example, in one text of the Pali tradition, the Buddha is talking about various different kinds of people. In particular, certain people who commit wrongs, other people who don't, certain people who have regrets, and other people who don't. And for the person who transgresses, who does wrong things and regrets it, the Buddha tells them, or somebody tells them, which I believe it probably is supposed to be the Buddha in this context, tells them, you would do well to give up the defilements born of transgression and get rid of the defilements born of regret, and then develop the mind and wisdom. And this is key, in the sense that while it may seem to us that regret is a sign of progress in some way along the path, in fact, the Buddha categorizes it alongside the transgressions themselves. It's a kind of a defilement, or associated with defilements, and therefore is the kind of thing we should get rid of. But we might say in response that the regret is doing some good here. That perhaps what the Buddha is really trying to tell us is that we should get rid of the defilements associated with the regret, but not get rid of the regret itself. Well, let's look a little deeper. As we go on in this sutta, the Buddha then talks about somebody who commits transgressions, who does wrong things, but does not have regret for it. In that case, he says, you would do well to give up the defilements born of transgression and then develop the mind and wisdom. That is, in this context, the Buddha doesn't add anything about developing regret, just to develop the mind and wisdom, which is something that he says to everybody who's not yet enlightened. So therefore it seems that even in the case of people who transgress, regret is not something that is suggested as an antidote. Instead, it appears as a kind of a defilement related to sadness or disappointment with ourselves. And it's, of course, a defilement, we might say, or a problematic emotion that does tend to arise naturally when we do bad things. Now, this understanding of regret as something problematic occurs more plainly in the context of meditation, where remorse, or kukucha, is seen as one of the 5 hindrances to meditation, in the context of restlessness and remorse. That is, that having remorse, we might say regret, for things that we've done, is associated with our own restlessness that keeps us from attaining meditative insights or reaching deep states of meditative absorption. But then we might ask, if such regret is always apparently unskillful, should we then not pay attention to our past actions? The Buddha certainly believed that reflection on the ethical character of our actions was beneficial. This is highlighted or revealed in particular in one early sutta where he is discussing ethical action with his son Rahula. In this early sutta, the Buddha talks about how we can act by way of body, speech, or mind, but that when we do so, we should always reflect upon whether the actions we're going to undertake are going to be harmful to ourselves or to others, or to both ourselves and others. He goes on to say that it's best to reflect in this way before undertaking these actions. If we can't do that, then at least we should reflect while we're doing them, because in those ways we'll at least, in the first way we'll avoid doing the action altogether. In the second way, we can perhaps stop ourselves in the middle of doing the action and that way avoid some of the bad results of that action. But if we're not able to do either of those two, then at least in the third option, we should reflect after having done the action. And if we realize that we've done something that's been harmful in this way, then the Buddha says, Rahula, you should confess, reveal, and clarify such a deed to the teacher or a sensible spiritual companion. And having revealed it, you should restrain yourself in the future. Now we should note here that there are two essential components to what the Buddha tells his son he should do in this case. He should confess having done this deed to somebody, his teacher or a sensible spiritual companion, and he should refrain from doing the deed in the future. The Buddha doesn't say anything here about regret. So the benefits of our ethical reflection upon our actions lie mostly in reflecting upon them before we undertake them or while we're in the midst of them. If we can't manage either of those two, then reflecting on our action after having done it is fine insofar as it gets us to avoid doing the action again, but there's no sense in simply replaying the regret over that action over and over again in our minds. That doesn't get us anywhere. Indeed, spending time on such regrets would only lead to restlessness and remorse, or difficulty meditating. And indeed, one of the things the Buddha says is so important about ethical action, about acting rightly, is that it preserves us from having to undergo restlessness and remorse. It preserves us from the natural reaction of our own regrets. Third, I want to touch on some of the apparent similarities between regret and guilt. It's often said, indeed believed, that regret is something fundamentally different from guilt. And in early Buddhism, that's something that I myself believed before undertaking the research for this video. But now my opinion has changed somewhat. I believe that the Buddha seems to have thought that regret and guilt were basically very, very similar, if not the same thing. The Buddha does not discuss guilt as such. However, he frames regret as a kind of a self-directed disappointment or sadness that is itself a defilement of a kind, or at least associated with such defilements. This emotion, then, is indeed tied to our self-identity, our feeling that there's something wrong with us, that we've done something wrong, even that we're a bad person. That's guilt personified. In the Buddha's eyes, though, our ethical reflection is more forward-looking and less identified with what we view as our self, or who we really are. That is, we're to make, as he says, a sincere determination not to repeat the same mistake in the future. There's no additional benefit to feeling sadness or disappointment with ourselves over and above that kind of sincere determination. So then it may occur to us to ask, what should we do when regret naturally arises in us? As I said at the beginning of this video, all of us, I think, have regrets. All of us know what it is to feel that kind of disappointment in ourselves. So what are we supposed to do with it? Well, we can try to disarm such feelings by following the Buddha's own practice technique. We can acknowledge our own past mistakes openly and without rationalizing them. We can perhaps confess to a friend or a sensible spiritual companion. And of course, we can resolve as best we can to act in a different way in the future. There's no point to self-flagellation. There's no point to self-hatred or to guilt or to a feeling that there's something wrong with us. There's no point in sadness and disappointment that continues. All of that is associated with defilements. So what's important, again, is our resolve, not our regret for past actions. And if regret persists, or if restlessness and remorse persist in our meditative experience, then the Buddha says we should deal with them through calming practices. As he says, when that mind is restless, it's the right time to develop the awakening factors of tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. Why is that? Because it's easy to settle a restless mind with these things. I've learned some surprising things about the Buddha's teaching in doing my research for this video. In particular, while it does seem, as I say, that regret is a natural emotional response to having made a mistake and perhaps caused suffering to somebody or to ourselves in the past, the Buddha does not believe that regret itself is a useful component to our practice. Regret itself is a kind of a problem, and as such, it's not something that we should encourage nor dwell upon when it arises. Instead, we should simply acknowledge, or try to acknowledge as best we can and openly acknowledge our own mistakes, and try as best we can not to make the same mistakes in the future. My question to you, therefore, is have you learned from your own past mistakes, of some particular mistake you've made in the past? Has a kind of a mindful openness to the possibility of mistakes helped you to grow wiser? If you want to see a past video, quite a long time ago in fact, where I discussed the idea of regret from a much earlier perspective, I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen, deal with some different suttas in that one. So if you're interested, take a look. And if you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider also taking a look at my Patreon page, as always, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.